Well, today I'm very excited to introduce my guest. But before I do, let me lay some of the philosophical and experiential groundwork for our conversation. There's a quiet but persistent tension at the heart of human life. On the one hand, we long for certainty, something stable to stand on, a belief, an identity, a framework that tells us this is true, this is right, this is who I am. But if we look closely through science, philosophy, or even our own direct experience, certainty begins to dissolve. What we find instead is something more fluid, more open, and at bottom, something deeply mysterious. Something we can point to, but never fully capture. No description, no concept, no story can fully contain whatever this is. Call it existence, reality, the Dharma, awareness, or God. But whatever we call it, our understanding of it will always remain partial, provisional. Now, for many, this leads to a kind of despair, to relativism or nihilism, the sense that either everything is equally true or nothing is meaningful at all. But for Karl Popper, this uncertainty pointed in a very different direction. He saw that our inability to achieve certainty was not a failure, but a feature of how knowledge grows. That our ability to be wrong and to discover that we are wrong is precisely what allows us to learn, to improve, to get closer to the truth, even if we never fully arrive. Knowledge, for Popper, advances through a living process of conjecture and refutation, a kind of disciplined humility, a willingness to let reality push back against us and to revise ourselves in response. And from this epistemology, he articulated a vision of what he called the open society, a society that protects this process, one that makes space for disagreement, for criticism, for error correction, one that allows our ideas and institutions to evolve rather than harden into dogma. But today, that vision feels strained. We find ourselves in a world of increasing polarization, ideological tribalism, and epistemic fragmentation, where criticism is often weaponized rather than used in service of truth, where social media amplifies certainty and outrage more than humility and inquiry. So, the question I want to explore today is this: what would it actually mean to live Popper's philosophy? Not just intellectually, but in how we relate to one another, how we raise our children, how we lead, how we build institutions, and how we hold our own beliefs. And perhaps more challengingly, can a society rooted in fallibility and openness actually withstand the human pull toward identity, belonging, and certainty? Today, I'm joined by someone uniquely positioned to explore these questions. Jeremy Shearmur spent 8 years working closely with Karl Popper as his research assistant and has devoted much of his life to developing, clarifying, and at times challenging Popper's ideas, particularly in political philosophy and the moral foundations of markets. Jeremy, it's a real honor to have you here.
Thanks very much. The problem with such introductions is that I can hardly wait after that to hear what I'm going to say, but I fear that I'm always likely to be highly disappointed in the result. At any rate, I'm very happy to talk with you about some of these matters, and just fire ahead and ask me questions.
Great. Yeah. Why don't we start with just a little intellectual background? How did you get interested in philosophy and economics?
Well, the story there is as follows. I attended a Quaker school in Essex, not that far from London. And as is common in the British education system, I ended up specializing. And I specialized basically in chemistry, mathematics, and history. And the guy at the school who was a career advisor said, "Oh, you should study economics," and suggested I applied to the London School of Economics. I was successful. And so I went there, never having studied economics before. And then I found basically that economics was taught very much like Kuhn's account of the education of a normal scientist. We were taught, as it were, these were certain kind of problems, these were the ways of resolving them, and then you had to be able to do more of these things. By sheer chance, I took, in the first year, you take a number of courses, and I happened to take a course on the foundations of mathematics. But then the one that I really enjoyed was, of all things, a course on logic. And I say of all things, just because logic as it is normally taught seems to me intellectually appalling. I mean, it's the kind of thing that really makes learning economics look intellectually exciting. But this particular course was taught in Popper's department of philosophy, and the department had grown up around him. There was a guy called Alan Musgrave who gave the lectures on logic, and he taught it in a way that followed Popper and a teacher of Popper's called Hahn. And this really was a matter of telling the story of the intellectual development of problems and its use, and then just teaching you techniques and so on in that context. Now, I mean, in a sense, it was a kind of tidied up version. You tended to get presented modern versions of what people had done historically. I mean, a little bit like if you're doing comparable things with regard to the calculus. If you're being taught the calculus, you wouldn't be taught it how Newton was actually working it. So it was this sort of tidied up version, but nonetheless, I just found this kind of approach really interesting and exciting. And then within the undergraduate specialized degree in economics, I was able to spend most of my time studying philosophy or political theory. I had to do a tiny bit of economics right through, but I basically did a philosophy specialization within that degree. I found the LSE philosophy department really exciting and interesting. I mean, it was taught in ways that were shaped by Popper's approach to things, but there was a lot of criticism and discussion. And I was able not just to attend undergraduate courses, but also I got permission to attend the research seminar that Popper gave on Tuesday afternoons from 2 until 4 o'clock. And this was incredibly intellectually exciting. You got a whole range of visitors presenting on their own ideas, raising problems and issues. I remember Noam Chomsky came and gave a talk about his work. It was very lively because the Hungarian historian and philosopher of mathematics, Imre Lakatos, was a member at the seminar, and he was really a very exciting and sort of intellectually pugnacious figure. And this I really found incredibly intellectually interesting, and it sort of spilled over into discussions in the department seminar room between undergraduates and graduate students and so on. And I just didn't come across anything like that anywhere else in the university.
Oh man, I would love to be in a classroom with Popper. So you spent 8 years with him. What kind of surprised you most about him as a person?
Okay. Well, first I should say I completed a taught master's degree, which in the UK system was typically building on the quite advanced undergraduate work one was doing. And the structure of the degree was normally that people would, after completing that successfully, might go on and do a PhD just by dissertation. So you can imagine that it was sort of roughly like doctoral coursework. But I decided at that point that I would get a qualification in university librarianship so that if there weren't any jobs in philosophy, I could make a living doing that while then going on to complete a PhD. But so I went away from the LSE to work as a so-called graduate apprentice in the University Library at Durham, and was then going on for a year to library school. But a friend of mine, a chap called Larry Briskman, who was teaching at Edinburgh, said, "Look, a job has just come up in philosophy of science. You should apply for it." And that was not uncommon at that time, that people could actually get such appointments prior to getting their PhD. But I wrote to my supervisor at the LSE, John Watkins, and said, would you be willing to support me? And he wrote back a nice letter that said, really, look, the people at this place where the job has come up aren't very sympathetic to the approach taken at the LSE. I could write for you, but there's something else that might interest you. Would you like to come and work as Karl Popper's full-time assistant? And it's a little bit like a young Catholic kid being asked if he'd like to go and work for the Pope. But at any rate, I said yes. Popper, I think, because I studied his work, I attended his seminar, I used to go to his lectures, and I so knew something about his approach, but also had got this background in librarianship, and so knew how to go and find things, which at that time was
before the internet.
Well, it was before the time that libraries had computerized catalogs. So it really was quite a task to go and find things. But at any rate, I went and worked for him. I was initially concerned with finding books and journal articles for him, and typically traveling out to his house. He, at that point, had retired, but was living about 30 miles outside of London. And I would go out there and work with him for the afternoon and evening, and then make my way back. As time went on, he would tell me about work that he was doing. He would draft things and ask me if I had any comments and suggestions. And indeed, Popper's written English is good, but when he concentrated on writing on things, he was really drawn by the ideas, and so his English grammar sometimes got lost.
Right. Right.
And so one of my tasks was just to go over and draw to his attention where there'd been problems and issues. And then
Mm,
at the end of my time with him, he might talk to me about something and then ask me to write a draft of something on the basis of what he'd been saying to me and the
mm,
notes that I'd been taking. And then he would come and rework it and use that as a basis for his stuff. But it was interesting. Popper's knowledge was immense. He also drove himself incredibly hard. I mean, if he got interested in an idea, and he was a man then well into his 70s, he might work all through the night on it. And it was also striking. I mean, his wife also came originally from Austria. They used to be very fond of mountains and so on.
yeah.
Occasionally would go off for a holiday in Switzerland. But very quickly, I would start receiving at the London School of Economics by mail stuff that Popper had been writing. So that was really just his life.
Yeah. That intellectual, that thinker of his never stopped, huh?
That's right.
That's fun. So, how did his philosophy show up in his character? Were there any tensions, or did you feel like he really lived his philosophy?
I think in certain respects, you could see Popper's emphasis on what he called the objective character of knowledge. And this is nothing to do with behaviorism or anything like that. It's
Right.
really on the idea that what we say or what we write has a content that can stand independently of us as people, which can be opened up to criticism and discussion. And there
Yeah.
is a sense in which this is a key theme in Popper's writings. But Popper himself, I sometimes thought, didn't quite go by that. I mean, I can give a couple of examples of this.
Yeah. Please.
When I was working as his assistant, one of my tasks was typically to take material which he had handwritten. His wife had then typed up a draft. He had then reworked it and annotated it. And he would often be found sort of writing right round the edge of paper, of a piece of paper and so on. It would be a complete mess. I would take that with me, and Popper's secretary at the LSE would then type it up. But one of my tasks would be to read over and discuss what he had written with Popper. And it might be issues just about the English, it might be questions about the ideas and so on. And the experience I quite often had is that I might raise a point about his interpretation of a particular view, and he would sort of say, "Oh, yes, you seem to feel very strongly about that, Jeremy. I can modify it." And my feeling was what I felt about it was neither here nor there. What I wanted was that he appraise it on its merits, but he
Yes.
tended to do it as if it was a kind of personal concession to me. And I was unhappy about that. And there was another example of this, that the system in the UK was typically that a professor, say, might give lectures on a particular topic, and then there would be so-called group tutorials on the material. I mean, you might say there was something like sections, but they were typically done with perhaps about 8 or 10 students, with a faculty member or a graduate student taking this group for the purposes of discussion. And this was necessary sometimes just because Popper, but also particularly Lakatos, when lecturing at the LSE, would really just tell us about their current research work. And then what would happen in the tutorials is that there would be, as it were, more bread and butter discussion of the actual topics for the syllabus, which might not relate particularly closely to the lectures. Now,
Mm.
on one occasion, I remember that there was a guy who was in the tiny history and philosophy of science department at University College London, an able man called Nicholas Maxwell. He was a good friend of mine. He was a very clever man, very driven by his ideas and somewhat possessed by his own ideas and concerns. And he was at one point taking these tutorials in connection with a series of lectures that Popper was giving. And Popper made some comment about his dislike of Maxwell. And it turned out that the reason for this was that on some occasion, when Maxwell was due to be taking these tutorials relating to Popper's lectures, he had arrived late. Now, it wasn't, as it were, that he had got anything wrong. He wasn't being hostile to Popper or whatever. And there was a sense in which, in Popper, these kinds of strongly driven personal reactions actually had quite a role in his own life, although this was in certain respects at odds with the broad message in his philosophy, which you could see possibly as something which set out to kind of correct a theme in his own life or writing.
So the man was human, huh?
Oh, yes, certainly. I mean, he was also quite an odd mix because he was if you met him, he would draw you into the middle of whatever he was working at and treating you as someone who was on a par with him in the sense of these things could be explained and so on, and would engage directly with you. And he didn't stand on ceremonies. He would typically be found in his house, dressed in a shirt with an old grey-coloured woolen sweater that could really have done with some with a hole patch in it and so on. And he came across as a simple, direct, honest man. And at the same time, he could, on some occasions, sort of very much stand on his dignity. So there was a sort of ambivalence about him and his character. It's also the case that he had a kind of track record of working very closely with, almost having an association as collaborators with people who had been his graduate students or faculty members. And then really he's getting rather upset if they published criticisms of his work. In a way, I think he tended to think rather that what should happen is that they should talk together and work together on the improvement of these things. And I think, too, that he was also someone, I mean, he got an incredible range of knowledge. I mean, one of the striking things was that I would telephone him from the LSE after his mail had arrived in the morning. And quite often he would be having letters from people working in different areas of science about current scientific development. So there would be stuff in physics, there'd be stuff in biology. One could never quite tell what might come up in this sort of context. And Popper was able to collaborate with people in terms of discussing issues right across the board. I mean, as he got older and as things tended to get that much more specialized, he, I think, started to find some of the highly specialized work more difficult to engage with. But he had this amazing knowledge of different developments. And in passing, I remember talking with him briefly about something in the area of phenomenology, where there was no reason why it was something about which he should have any knowledge at all. But it turned out that he did. And one could, I mean, it was a very, very humbling experience. I mean, I went to work for him when I was quite young. I really didn't know much. I had little self-confidence, but one problem was that while he wasn't overbearing, the sheer experience of working with and for someone who seemed to know so much about everything was really very humbling.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, that's a lost art. I fear we've moved too far into specialization and we've kind of lost a bird's eye view of things.
Yeah.
But okay, let's shift now into the open society. Do you mind? I know I briefly touched on it in the beginning, but do you want to just speak a little bit to what the open society is, what kind of values it requires?
I'm very happy to do that. It seems to me that at the heart of Popper's idea of an open society was, as you were bringing out in what you said, that all of our knowledge, all of our social assumptions, all of what our leaders are doing is fallible and is stuff which, in principle, is open to improvement. And I mean, I don't want to make a kind of party political speech, but I can think of certain political leaders not a million miles away from you, basically never seem willing to admit that they have made a mistake about anything. And
Yeah.
Popper, I think, wanted to stress a key idea of an open society is that our knowledge, even our best knowledge, is fallible. This, though, was something very different from taking the view that just all ideas and all claims are equally good. I mean, a central theme in Popper's epistemology is this experience that he had of growing up with Isaac Newton's ideas as a kind of paradigm of knowledge, to the point where some people were wondering if, in some sense, they might even be true by definition.
Mhm.
And yet, these being then challenged and improved on by Einstein's work. And I
Yeah.
think that it's this, in a certain sense, which is at the heart of things for Popper. But I would stress that in this context, it really is crucial for Popper that we can come to learn about problems and why all sorts of things that might look appealing don't actually work. Second, that we need to be able to understand just what our existing theories have been able to do, what they've been able to explain, but also what their weak points are, and thus what it might amount to produce something which is an advance on them. Another, I think, very important thing which poses some interesting problems for us is that Popper, particularly in some of his later work, stressed the role played by what he called background knowledge. And this is the notion that at any one point, we have to take for granted all kinds of things which we don't question while working on a particular problem or issue. It's not that they may not be false. It's not that they may not be questionable, but that we have to concentrate, as it were, on one thing against possibly a shifting background of such assumptions at any one time. And this, I think, in our situation today poses really quite an interesting problem. What do I have in
Yeah.
mind? Well, Popper was very critical of figures who sort of stood up and spoke with the authority of science. And Popper said, no, scientific knowledge is fallible. But at the same time, I think if you look at our contemporary society, typically people turn their backs on experts. They turn their
Yeah.
backs on anyone they deem to be an elite. And
Mhm.
where else are you going to get this kind of background knowledge from but these people? And the big problem, I think, facing us at the moment is that we are apt to have various prejudices, which Popper stresses we have. But his view really is what you have to do is to try and learn from other people where you've got things wrong, especially from people who take different views or who come out of
Mhm.
different traditions. What we are apt to do is look on the internet or social media for stuff that confirms our prejudices. And given how social media has developed, it basically becomes an engine for
Yes.
catering to our prejudices. And this wasn't a problem that Popper himself was concerned with, but I think it's a serious and quite interesting problem facing us today. So I would see this epistemological concern as playing a key role in Popper. But he also emphasized very strongly the importance, really, of people's autonomy. And also, he was very concerned about human suffering. And he wanted to say, look, we typically have a variety of different ideas and ideals. These are often things that can't easily be shifted simply by engaging in rational argument. What do you do in the face of this? Well, one of the things Popper wanted to emphasize is the idea that people could work together to try to find out if they could agree that certain things are problematic and then look at political policy as being directed towards these things. But at the same time, Popper wanted to stress the fallibility of public policy and on the need for critical feedback. And I think one of our weaknesses in Western democracies is that we haven't really got on top of the notion that we should be open to critical feedback and to
Yeah.
be willing to learn. And a tiny anecdote in that context. Popper occasionally got very, almost had an E-Day fix about various things in politics or public policy. And one of these that I remember him talking to me about was John F. Kennedy's conduct at the time of the Cuba crisis. And one of the things that Popper noted in this context was that Kennedy had a kind of panel that he recruited to try out his ideas. And he included in this Adlai Stevenson. That's to say, someone who really was pretty well known as taking a very different view on these matters from him. And this notion of setting up institutions and also making sure that you got critical feedback from people who had views that were different from your own seems to me to be quite an interesting one. And again, to contrast with the tendency that we seem to have increasingly at the moment of prime ministers and presidents basically just consulting yes men.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You covered a lot of my questions there.
I'm sorry.
No, that was perfect. Yeah, one of those, I wanted to get into social media because I see that as one of the greatest epistemic threats currently that we face. And another one that you mentioned is this distrust that we have towards our institutions and our elites. So, yeah, with this background knowledge, it's like, well, okay, you're going to go to the grocery store clerk for your heart surgery. It's like, no, you,
Well, it's a very interesting problem, and I think there are. If I can make a few comments about this, I mean,
yeah,
first of all, one of the things that Popper highlights in his book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, is what he calls the strain of civilization. And
mm,
this basically is the notion that we typically come historically from societies which were much smaller, where we knew people pretty much on a face to face basis. And we
yeah,
have also experienced various kinds of pretty dramatic change. And I mean, it's very striking at the moment the way in which, for example, in the US, um, you have a significant problem for small rural towns where they historically had depended on large farming populations. You've now
hmm,
got farms which can basically be farmed by one or two people and a
yeah,
lot of machinery. What then happened? Well, often it turns out you got small scale manufacturing industries round about these. And these have been things which have been hit particularly hard by the opening up of free trade. Plus, also, there are more general problems about a lot of the things which gave us a kind of security and employment and in our expectations as a result of the development of information technology, robotics, and now AI. And a real difficulty in this context is that basically we are driving these developments just on the grounds that the goods and services that are being provided are speaking to our tastes and passions, but we may find that the consequences of our acting on the basis of these tastes and passions can be quite disconcerting, and that particularly small towns have often really been hollowed out. I mean,
yeah,
people may find that it's doubtful if they can really keep their local schools going. But
yeah,
if people are there, then what services are offered? If kids go off to college elsewhere, they just get used to lots of things being available which aren't back at home. And a
yeah,
difficulty. This is just one simple illustration, but where it is very easy to see how people react with a mixture of despair and feeling betrayed, and then can be very open to populist solutions to problems, although
yes,
they don't actually stop to ask, well, how is this supposed to resolve the problem? Now, I think you can add to this because there is another theme in Popper's work. It came, I think, after his Open Society, where he talked about the idea of a fatherless society. And one might these days be a bit hesitant about his choice of the word, but his notion is that
yeah,
there has been a kind of fall off in authority of figures in society, and that we are, in many respects, now on our own. I mean, that we are not having to defer to people in quite the way in which we were in the past. And one might look at this in terms of our almost having entered a sort of gig society. It's in this context where some of your issues about about social media and so on can kick in terms of where we go to for influences. And there is
yeah.
yet a further twist, and that is, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Robert Putnam on bowling alone. No? Okay, well, it's well worth considering. Putnam is a Harvard political scientist, and he was engaged initially with some people in Italy in some work about the introduction of a new level of local government in Italy. And what he and his colleagues came up with was the notion that this actually worked well where there was a kind of history of social trust. And that, he further said, was related typically to a history of people's participation in voluntary groups and organizations, which were of a non hierarchical character and brought together people from different ways of life and different perspectives. I mean, you might imagine an opera society in a small Italian town. There might be a tradition of particular parades that people get together, and so on. And what he was struck by was really, and what he then wrote about, was the way in which, in the US, there had been a tradition, which Tocqueville had commented on, and which was still in many ways pretty live historically, of participation by citizens in all kinds of groups and activities. And his book, his paper, Bowling Alone, and then a great thick book, Bowling Alone, was documenting in some detail how this notion of participation by people from different perspectives had really fallen off very badly. There was, to be sure, people might say, well, I'm a member of a particular environmental organization, but this essentially means sitting at home with a keyboard and sending them
Yeah.
some money.
Yeah.
And where Putnam wanted to argue that the consequence of this was a fall off in social trust. Now, if you asked him why and what could be done about it, his responses, I think, were a little bit feeble. But one of the things he put his finger on when he was writing on this stuff was the impact of television, and particularly the impact of quality stuff being available through television. And if you think about it, what is striking now is the huge variety of stuff that's available, to the degree where there's not actually much of a shared framework, because
Oh, yeah.
but equally, it's the case that lots of activities that people used to go out of their homes to participate in, drama groups, discussion groups, all kinds of things, are just falling off because people can get world-class stuff delivered to them at home. And this also, I think, is a kind of problem that we particularly are facing now.
Absolutely. Leading to higher rates of depression, suicide, just isolation. Yeah. But I do have hope there. I am seeing a revival in communities.
One of the other things which one might think is a little bit hopeful is this. I think that while some aspects of social media are certainly very positive, they also do have the kind of problems associated with them that you've highlighted. I mean, namely, that we get this stuff for free. The incentive on the people designing them then becomes keeping our attention.
Yeah.
And the best way to do that is to give us stuff that's salacious, or stuff which is speaking to our prejudices, either positively or telling us just how awful the people we didn't like are.
Yeah.
But where you might say, well, it's conceivable that something may be at hand which can help. And I'm thinking here of paid large language models. And what I have in mind in this is the paid bit, I think, is quite important, because if we're paying for them and if they're being used by people for business purposes, they basically don't want to have a whole lot of stuff that's driven by advertising or other sorts of distractions. Now,
Yeah.
I think what's needed is to develop a culture of how to learn with these things and how to interact with them, and how to get the best out of them. But it seems to me, I mean, I found with my own research that if I get interested in a particular topic, I can get leads to academic literature that I simply had never heard of
Mhm.
by doing such a search. And I personally find it really very useful. I mean, if I'm writing something and I've got some ideas, I will then use it to check out, well, what is its response? What happens if you compare them? There are big problems about it. I mean, it may
Yeah.
be misleading, it may just give you stuff which is just wrong, but if you compare it to the following, I mean, imagine that you had got interested in something and you simply had the opportunity to ask even quite a large group of people. I mean, say faculty members in a particular area. Look, can you suggest uh, some good things that I should be looking at on this? You wouldn't expect that they'd have everything. Their opinions
Right.
may be way off, but
Right.
certainly it's a whole sight better than you're going to get from the people you know immediately on social media, together with what other feeds just get
Yeah.
pushed into there. And so I
Absolutely.
think, but there's a twist to that because I don't think that it's just the social, I don't think it's just the large language models that help us, but I think there is this issue, which I tend to feel is more and more significant, of trying to cultivate deliberately various cultures which can assist us in negotiating with things. And I've been struck recently. I mean, Popper talked about the strains of civilization, but he really gave us almost a kind of stoic response. You know, these are things that you have to, you know, kind of grin and bear it. But my feeling is that we are increasingly coming across problems where we have actually to see if we can cultivate traditions and institutions and cultures which can help us and guide us so as to really help us avoid
Yeah.
some of the problematic unintended consequences of acting just on the basis of our own preferences. I mean,
Yeah.
if you
So,
go back to the history of liberalism, John Stuart Mill talked about self regarding and other regarding preferences. And a lot of our problems are now cropping up in the area of broadly self regarding preferences. There are some things that are kind of macro level products of us and other people acting on the basis of them. For example, demographic problems. I mean, there's a sense in which there's been a kind of huge liberation. People can make choices, but where often when one gets to about my age, you then kind of look around and think, well, there seem now to be an awful lot of people roughly my age. A lot of us may be in need of assistance. We also need people to be working in the economy, but no one's there. And
yeah.
typically, the penny only drops. The realization only comes when you hit an age roughly like mine, and by which time it's a little bit late to try and do anything about it on a personal level. But equally, there are these problems about community and how you can cultivate that in a changing world. There are
Yeah.
also problems about the public sphere. I mean,
Well,
one of
so let me stop you there so we can get through my questions. But I think that was a perfect segue into this question of how we can guard against some of these dangers we've talked about with social media, with populism, with this distrust for the elites. How do we incentivize the values needed for an open society? How do we develop its moral backbone given where we're at?
And that problem you're wanting me to resolve in the few minutes that we've got. I mean, I guess what I would say is we need to, I think, to start by identifying clearly what some of the problems are. And for example, in Cass Sunstein in his #Republic gave what I thought was a really very telling discussion of the consequences of the sort of social polarization that we're experiencing for the operation of American institutions. So you get him putting his finger on that. I think there are comparable problems in a number of these other areas. I think that the first step is really to write and talk about these things to see to what extent we can get agreement. And I mean, you may say, well, isn't it completely straightforward? But I'm not sure that it is, on the grounds that what is being touched on are a lot of freedoms that people really enjoy exercising. And actually coming to the conclusion that there may be some really difficult consequences coming out of these things, I think is going to be intellectually a significant move. Second, it seems to me that it is crucial to get people to think in terms of, okay, if there are problems, what institutions might help and assist us? And I stress that just because there is quite often an identification of problems, but it comes along with simply a culture of protest. It's as if, as it were, if we jump up and down and wave flags and march about this, something should happen. But if these things are, as I typically think they are, consequences of the actions that in the sort of society that we've got, it's beguiling for all of us to take, then second, while identifying things as problems is important, one has to recognize that that in itself isn't enough.
Yeah.
What
So
is
let's take a solid example here. Let's say social media. And we've seen this shift from our historical news and media sources, and people are now getting their news and information from social media where there aren't the same kind of journalistic standards, editors, or gatekeepers. Is there something that we could do in this arena? Any kind of legislation that we might impose upon these social media companies? Do you have any solutions?
well, I guess my view would be to say that one might be able to go for legislation, but you have to bear in mind that just because there's a problem and that it's widely admitted that there's a problem doesn't necessarily going to mean that you're going to get, by way of legislation, stuff that is fit for purpose to deal with it. And what I have in mind is that if you actually look, and certainly at any Western democracies that I know anything about, the actual process of public policy formation is open to all kinds of lobbying
Yeah.
of sorts that really may militate against good solutions. So I wouldn't want to rule it out. I think that in the US, you have some advantages of the institution of the Supreme Court, where
Yeah.
you may get stuff which, on the one side, is put forward in a way that actually has to comply with the tradition of the rule of law that you have in the US, but where on the other side there is quite an effective semi-public sphere of critical reflection in the law journals and in serious newspapers about what the Supreme Court might be doing or is going to do, which
Yeah.
may help us there. But
Yeah.
the other direction in which I would be tempted to go is to see if there is stuff that is already out there or potentially out there, which it's possible to build on. And here I earlier mentioned paid large language models,
Yeah.
because with the emphasis on paid, because they are not, at least currently, advertising driven. Some of the, I've been just
Right.
been reading that some of the free ones are, but the paid ones with any luck aren't. And you may find, I mean, say if you're interested in the news, where are your best sources? Well, often they will be things like the news pages of the Wall Street Journal. Why? Well, because the news pages in the Wall Street Journal, if they're giving information about what's happening in financial affairs and stuff that may pertain to it, it is significant for them actually to try and get the story right, because
Right.
people's money. And one might say a similar kind of thing with regard to influencers. I mean, there is a real problem, I think, about how they have developed, where you
Yeah.
basically get people who are selling advice on the basis of how much they've been paid to
Yeah.
try and give the advice. And I think to try to see if there could be other models, to see if one could try to develop social media of a more Popperian kind.
Yeah.
I mean, you can argue about the need for it, but people may then be able to try it out. You might be able to sell to a foundation the idea that it would be good for them to try to encourage this a bit. And there is a key theme in Popper, which is the significance of epistemological and social pluralism. That, in his view, quite legitimately, there can be different perspectives on things, different values, different ideals. And a key theme in his work is the importance of our getting criticism from those perspectives. Yet, this is the very thing which now becomes very difficult socially. There
Yeah.
are, but I think our time is probably running out on this, and maybe you'd be interested in a follow up discussion about it. That it seems to me that there is another facet to this stuff, which is that criticism and improvement is important, but it's also the case that a lot of stuff is, as it were, historically given. That I have a particular historical background, have been formed by it, as have you.
Yeah.
There's a sense in which all of us have got a trail of historical path dependency leading up to where we are, and to tastes, norms, forms of social life, and so on, which can't easily be changed very much. We can still learn from one another, but I think a big problem in an open society is how do we get effective learning, but also how do we give people a degree of protection so that it's not, as it were, as if they are naked with spotlights on them all the time, which can itself be really disconcerting and worrying for the people concerned.
Yeah. I want to respect your time. If you want to do a follow up, I'm happy to do that.
I would suggest that this might merit a follow up if you find it
Okay.
interesting, just on the
Yes.
grounds that I would see it as taking up some things which are opened up by Popper's work, but where we still have to grapple with the problems. For example, people have talked, I mean, Popper himself, and also a good friend of mine who's a a Muslim critical rationalist, Ali Paya, and they've talked about critical rationalism as a way of life. Now, I'm not sure that that is quite right. I think what we have to do is to think of how a plurality of ways of life can be developed within the bounds of critical rationalism. But that
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
would take to be an interesting topic. You might not agree, but if it is, I think it's something which possibly merits a conversation in its own right.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think the center of the bullseye for me is how epistemology plays into our morality and our values. And yeah, having this pluralistic society with many different competing ideals. And within that, something we weren't able to touch today, which I would like to discuss in our next conversation, is this concept that Popper created, the paradox of tolerance.
This would be good. Well, what I would say is I am certainly available if you could stand another session, really just to discuss some of those things. So
Yeah,
that would
yeah, let's
just
do
be
it.
great.
Let's do it.
Okay,
All
that's
right.
fine.
Well, why don't you leave our listeners today with just one bit of advice one little bit of wisdom you'd like to pass off to the next generation of thinkers and intellects?
Oh dear. I think that that is really pretty difficult. I don't know. I mean, I think the real problem is this. One can look back to the time when one was a student and think of the energy one had then, and also just how inhibited one was because one was conscious that one didn't really know anything much. At the same time, I'm very conscious of having wasted a great deal of time and opportunity. And so, if I could go back and relive my life, I would, I hope, be a little more intellectually adventurous,
Mm.
a bit more modest, a bit harder working. Whether I could sensibly wish that onto anyone else now, I don't know. But I'm just very conscious of the way in which now I'm in my late 70s. I am regularly finding new and fascinating things that I just didn't know anything about before.
Mm.
And the thought, really, that either senility or death may catch up on me and cut that off is really
Yeah.
rather sad. And so I'm just sorry that I didn't put a lot more hard work into this when I was younger.
Mm. It's a big old world out there and in here, and time is precious. So thank you, Jeremy. I really appreciate your time.
Well,
I look
thank you
forward
for
to next
giving
time.
me, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. It's been great fun.
All right. Until
Okay,
next time.
thank you.